7 years after the Wright brothers' history-making flight at Kitty Hawk, most Americans had yet to see an airplane. To generate interest and create an industry, the Wright brothers took their airplanes to the people. 1910 became the year of air shows, and aviation history was made right here in Interlaken. The 10-day Interlaken Air Show was billed as America's greatest air meet. It was sponsored by the Aero and Motor Club of Asbury Park to generate tourism. It was called the Asbury Park Aviation Meet at Interlaken, since Interlaken was considered a restricted suburb of Asbury Park at the time, and Interlaken had the only large space available for such an event. The first day of the meet was met with much anticipation, since signs were posted all over in advance, and the events were covered by local and major city newspapers all over the country as well. Thousands flocked to the 40-acre field on the northwest section of Interlaken, stretching from Interlaken Park all the way to Windermere Avenue. They came to see the 5 Wright brothers trained pilots perform their death-defying feats. On Monday, August the 10th, excitement was in the air. The crowd shouted and cheered, and automobile horns sounded. Spectators were about to witness record-setting feats and the horrifying tragedies. Deemed as an overwhelming success by both sponsors and attendees, the famous Interlaken Airfield Meet drew over 100,000 spectators and played an important role in the aviation history. The Interlaken Air Show was held in August of 1910. It started on the 10th of August and it went up until the 23rd, actually 3 days longer because of bad weather. The air show was sponsored by the Aero and Motor Club, of a group of Asbury Park businessmen, to take advantage of the aviation hype at the time and draw vacationers to Asbury Park. They intended to use the beach as they did in Atlantic City for the meet, but that proved impractical, so an open 40-acre field was found in nearby Interlaken. They sold $10 shares in the club to raise prize money and to pay the aviators and the rights to bring their airplanes. After all expenses were paid, investors saw little return for their investment. Interlaken profited greatly from the event, since it was a slow-developing little community and drawing 100,000 people to the little cottage community to buy lots and start a building boom that lasted through the 1930s. The air show was a lead-in to the annual September Carnival and Baby Parade to promote tourism. Queen Titania and her court were selected from Asbury Park's prettiest girls, with thousands lined in the streets for the coronation and the baby parade. A loving cup and $3,000 worth of prizes were given over 8 categories for the winners of the baby parade. Miss Lillian Sexton of Asbury Park was crowned the queen of the show.
My name is Lillian Sexton of Asbury Park, and I was crowned Queen Titania of the Asbury Park Carnival, which is part of the air show. Here I got to sit in the flying machine with Birdman Archie Hoxsey.
The program book was a bestseller at 10 cents. The cover featured an aerial view of Asbury Park and the surrounding area photographed from a balloon anchored at 1,000 feet above the casino at the south end of the Asbury Park boardwalk to attract attention to the air meet. We see a new disease of the time. It was called aviation neck. Aviation was very new to the area, and people were always looking up in the air for it. I guess it relates to our sore thumbs today from texting.
My name is Madison. My friends and I came to the Interlaken Air Show to see those daring birdmen in their flying machines and maybe get to meet them or the Wright brothers personally.
On the left, Governor J. Franklin Ford poses for a photograph with Arch Hoxsey.
Madison, Megan, and I wore our Sunday best to make a good impression on the Birdman.
We see the Wright brothers. Some of the history says that the both were here, and some said that only Wilbur was here. So at this point, we're still not too sure whether it was both of them, but many of the things say they were both here. Orville was in a very bad plane crash just a little over a year prior to the Interlaken Air Meet. So that might have been one of the reasons he wasn't here most of the time, but maybe just made a quick appearance. We see 4 of the Birdmen pilots at the Interlaken Meet prior to the start. Arch Hoxsey of Pasadena, California. He was a flyer of skill and daring and known for his recklessness. Arch made his name at Interlaken. He actually died in a crash the last day of 1910. Ralph Johnstone of Kansas City. He was known around the world as a vaudeville trick bike rider. He was already famous among aviators and made a specialty of stunts and feats of endurance. He died in a crash at Denver meet in November of 1910. Frank Coffin of New York City was considered an aviator of great promise, cautious and reliable. He lived to be 82 and trained pilots during World War I. Walter Brookins of Dayton, Ohio. He was known as the world's greatest aviator. Walter held the United States and Canada world records for altitude in an airplane of 6,275 feet. He was the champion of the world for quick turns, making a complete circle in 62.5 seconds. First pilot trained by the Wright brothers, and he was the first to crash at Interlaken. Duval LaChapelle of France and Detroit, Michigan, had been associated with the Wright brothers for several years and was with them in Europe. He held the Canadian speed record at the time. He had poor eyesight that he kept from the Wright brothers. On the left we see Wilbur Wright with Johnstone and Hoxley. Here's the public relations chairman of the Aero Club, H.E. Denegar. On Wednesday, August the 17th, was supposed to be Scientist Day. It was the 8th scheduled day of the meet, and it turned out to be too windy to fly. Thomas Edison was scheduled to be there for the events, but since they had to be canceled, his planned appearance did not happen. A daily program was posted on bulletin boards every day, listing the events and the aviators. The meet took place on a 40-acre field on the northwest corner of Interlaken. It bordered Corliss Avenue, then called Deal Beach Avenue. On the east, Wekapeka, running north, Grassmere, and on the west, and Rona, which then bent eastward along Woodmere Avenue. The grandstands were erected on the western side of the field bordering Wekapeka Drive with a canvas-covered fence. The grandstands had a seating capacity of 10,000 people. Only the true adventurers were said to purchase grandstand seats, for there was the remote possibility that there could be a mishap, and a mishap or two did occur. In addition to the airplanes, there were dirigibles and balloons. This shows some of the dirigibles flying over the grandstands at the Interlaken meet. The fatal jump. On day 3 of the meet, 2 parachutists were scheduled to jump from Johnny Mac's hot air balloon. The balloon rose to 4,000 feet as scheduled, and Fleming, the first parachutist, dropped first. The balloon rose further and Prince jumped next. While attempting to adjust his parachute, Prince fell to his death, passing Fleming on the way down and landing in an apple tree on George Conover's property 75 feet from the field, and was killed on impact. He hit the ground with such force that he left a dent in the ground. Stunned spectators watched in horror. Scores of women fainted and others turned their backs on the falling man and ran for the exit. In keeping with the enterprising spirit of the era, the area was fenced off, and a fee of 5 cents was charged for curious seekers to view the broken tree limb and indentation in the ground where Prince landed. Mac was released from his contract for the rest of the meet. The sponsors of the event donated $100 toward Prince's funeral expenses, and the meet continued. Walter Brookins, piloting the Wright brothers' plane, was the first to take off at the Interlaken meet. He took off from a rail launching pad. Most airplanes in those days did not have wheels. The aircraft engine sputtered and coughed as it attained an altitude of about 300 feet. Brookins was able to circle the field 2 or 3 times, losing altitude all the time. For a moment it looked as if the airplane was going to crash into the stands. Everything went fine until he came in for the final landing, and the field was filled with reporters and photographers. He banked steeply to avoid them and the crowd in the grandstand as the plane flipped and struck 7 spectators on the ground. The plane was wrecked. Brookins suffered a broken nose, and the spectators all suffered minor injuries. The Wright brothers shipped replacement planes on the 15th, and Brookins was back in the air. The photo of the crash is very rare because promoters quickly rushed to the field to keep photographers away, fearing that they would have a negative effect on the future attendance. Didn't have to worry. Next day the attendance doubled. After Brookins' crash, the Wrights shipped in new planes for them to use in the meet. Here we see what turned out to be the first planes with wheels. Most of the planes just had these skids like you see on the plane, but there's also wheels. They were the first time they were used in public. Brookings' crash resulted in the first aviation lawsuit. Morris Gorsuch, an 18-year-old, was selling programs at the meet when Brookings crashed and was injured and sued for $15,000. It was the first aviation lawsuit in U.S. history. Gorsuch acted quickly. Brookings was served with papers on the field on the 22nd. The case dragged on and came to court 2 years later in 1912. A jury was picked, but no trial was held. The judge dismissed the case, saying Gorsuch failed to make his case. The following slides show the aviators flying over and around the field, some taking off and some landing. You'll get to notice in the background the grandstands and some of the tents that were used for refreshments and also for as a hospital and so forth.
What a feeling. Feels good through the ceiling, high. We fly through the sky so high.
This was another first for the Interlaken Air Show. Ralph Johnstone made history at Interlaken by being the first aviator to strike an automobile with a plane. Ralph was the pilot of one of the Wright brothers' new replacement airplanes sent after the Brookings crash. Johnstone was battling a 20-mile-an-hour wind on takeoff, lost power, and was forced to the ground and into a fence and wrecking the plane. He blamed the new wheels on the plane. If it had been on the skids alone, I would have been all right. But the wheels carried me into the fence. From the fence, he bounced into H.D. Hackman's car, damaging the light and the radiator. The Wrights hadn't invented brakes at this point. Many historians will tell you that the first airmail flight took place at Interlaken. The air meet is credited with the first unofficial airmail flight. Walter Brookings and Arch Huxley took off from the Interlaken airfield and flew over to the Deal Golf Club and delivered a letter and flew back to the Interlaken airfield. Arguably the first airmail delivery flight. This was the first night flight. The first publicly witnessed night flight took off from Interlaken Airfield for an unscheduled flight over Asbury Park. Huxley and Johnstone were always trying to outdo each other. Together, they spontaneously decided to fly by the light of the moon, soaring over Asbury Park and returning to the Interlaken Airfield. Pilot Frank Coffin, the most conservative of pilots, threatened to lock up the plane so they couldn't fly. Wilbur Wright told reporters, "An automobile joyrider in his maddest moment was a poor second to an aviator." I am convinced that if these two fledgling aviators were left to themselves for 2 weeks without oversight, they would all be dead. Huxley and Johnstone were both killed in plane crashes by the end of 1910. Hot air balloons were a big part of the Interlaken Air Show. On day 2, one of Johnny Mac's balloons had trouble getting back and landed on E.E. Jackson's farm. An irate Jackson held the balloon at shotgun point for ransom, demanding $100. When clearer heads prevailed, Jackson settled for $5.72. Breaking it down, it was loss of milk, 50 cents, damage to the cabbage patch, $1.74, scaring the colts, 89 cents, shock to Mrs. Jackson, 95 cents, same to the self and son, $1.49, and scaring all critters, 15 cents. The following slides will show some of the pop culture that took place during this period of time in 1910.
My boyfriend is a birdman, and he is giving me flying lessons.
Interlaken had a very special connection to the Wright brothers. 2 Interlaken artists, Frank Stick, also the borough's first mayor, and William H.D. Croner were among a group of Monmouth County residents who donated the land for the Wright Brothers Monument in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, site of today's Wright Brothers Memorial National Park. In 1928, plans for the monument were stalled in Congress by opponents concerned with its cost. Stick and two associates owned the Kill Devil's Hill tract and offered to gladly deed these hills and adjacent land for the monument and preservation without cost. As more land was added, the donated tract measured more than a mile long and a half a mile wide. The 60-foot memorial opened in 1932.